On today's show, my old friend David Schloss joins me to debate the merits of Adobe's latest change to Lightroom. Lightroom CC, Lightroom Classic, Lightroom WTF. Good morning and welcome everybody to PhotoJoseph's Photo Moment, the first thrice weekly, now we get the pattern down right, thrice weekly live show here on YouTube at youtube.com/PhotoJoseph every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific. You can watch the show live, which is the really fun part because then you get to participate in the chat and we can talk to each other and you can ask questions and all kinds of good stuff like that. And today, we are here with my good friend David Schloss. We've known each other for quite a while. I'm going to bring him on screen in just a moment here. But before I let him chime in, I get to talk about him. So David is the editor right now, editor-in-chief of Digital Photo Pro magazine. If you are not a subscriber, that is definitely something to go check out. And he is, he's been doing this for a while, but our history goes back quite a ways farther. Back. We got to know each other probably well over 10 years ago when I was still at Apple, and he was working on or created a project called Aperture Users Network. Some of you may have remembered that from back in the day. It was an online forum, a resource for Aperture users, which was a wonderful, wonderful thing long before Aperture got killed. But that, as they say, is now sadly ancient history. So I'm going to go and bring David on and let him introduce himself a little bit more. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I think the ancient history comment is interesting, though, because that's kind of what we're debating here today, right? I mean, I think that's a lot of what people are wondering about. And you're right, we do go back a very long time. You and I met. I was working closely with Apple, although, you know, legally I can't say anything more than I was working closely with Apple. And you were working at Apple, and you know there was a lot of excitement about Aperture, right? Mm-hmm. So it launched. There was really nothing else like it happening at the time. It did photo management, it did editing, it did it all in one package. It did it with Apple's usual, you know, UI look and feel to it. And Lightroom was announced just slightly after Aperture was announced, and then you know took a while to come out of beta. And you know then there was this back and forth between the two apps of who was going to win, and Apple was going in a slightly more pro direction. It felt like to a lot of people in terms of the asset management, and Lightroom was going in a more pro direction in terms of image editing
features. Yeah,
and then Apple kept promising, you know, new aperture coming, don't worry about it, it will always exist. And then
it didn't.
We are where we are today, where it didn't. So I think, I'm guessing that's why, you know, today's show is going to be interesting, is because we have that history of you know, companies promising something.
And things changing up from underneath us.
And things changing.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you talk about the beginning of Aperture and then beginning of Lightroom. The rumor that I had always heard, and I've never had a confirmation, but let's see if you know the same rumor, was that Lightroom had actually been developed long before. Then it got shelved because Adobe said, we don't want to cannibalize Photoshop, so they shelved Lightroom. And then once Apple announced Aperture, Adobe went, oh, well, I guess this might be a good idea after all, pulled it out, dusted it off, and that's why it hit beta so quickly. It was months, I think, after Aperture was announced or released. And then, you know, over the course of another year, they got it up into a much finer app.
Yeah, that's about 80% of the story, and there's probably only 2 or 3% more of the story that I can say. I was an alpha tester on what became Lightroom. So, you know, anything I did there was confidential under the agreement of being an alpha tester. It wasn't shelved. It was in active development. I can just say that it wasn't being actively developed for that day. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't going to come out the day that it was announced. I think that there was market pressure from Aperture.
Right.
So I think all I can say about that is it wasn't something that they pulled off the shelf and said, hey, let's make a Lightroom. It was being worked on at the time.
Got it. Fair enough. All right. Well, good to know. I'll straighten out that little history lesson there. So, as always, people, we do have the live chat going. So, for those who are watching live, if you have any questions or comments for us on this topic, of course, let's keep the comments on topic today. Just put @PhotoJoseph in front of it, and we will occasionally throughout the show switch over to comments and go back and read through them and see if there's any questions that we can answer at the moment. Now, I just want to say hello to everybody who is watching live. All you folks here, thank you so much for tuning in. Marvin, good morning. Trevor, Trevor's variety show is usually PhotoJoseph fighting with tech gremlins. He's right. That is usually the variety show beforehand. I'm like, there's something around here.
I'm the gremlin today.
You're the gremlin today. Excellent. Hello to England and all over the world. Let's get a little shout out in here. We'll pull it up later of where you guys are all calling in from today. It's always fun to see where we are getting people in. We usually have quite the global audience, which is really fun to see. So the whole point of today's show, for those of you who haven't logged into the internet in the last couple of weeks, is Adobe made a major update to Lightroom in the sense that they have now split the app out, and there's two versions. What we've always known as Lightroom CC is now called Lightroom Classic, and they have a brand new app called Lightroom CC. So just to kind of confuse things a little bit there. And CC, of course, is for Creative Cloud. And this time, when they say cloud, they really mean it. The expectation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what they've announced, and then this is where Dave and I are going to get into a debate of what this actually means and what it means for the future of us as photographers, us as users. What they've announced is that this cloud version, the new version, is cloud-based, meaning that when you import your pictures, everything gets uploaded to the cloud. Now, for everybody who says, oh my God, I don't have that fast of an internet connection, it's okay. Once you import, you still have your pictures there locally. It updates over time. It eventually trickles them up there. And the advantage of this, of course, is you can then log into Lightroom on any system, Mac OS, PC, Windows, Android, iOS, whatever it might be, and access the same photos, which obviously has huge advantages to it, and that is very similar to the Photos app workflow from Apple. Now, they are simultaneously, I'm glad you're nodding, so if I do anything wrong, you can say, no, that's not right.
I also want the people to know that I'm still alive.
Okay, good. Well, alive is good. Alive and nodding is good. Simultaneously, they have updated what is now called Lightroom Classic. This is the same Lightroom we've always had. It has some enhancements for this release. One of the biggest, most notable things is speed. They've made some significant speed improvements to it, and it continues to work the way it always had, as a local system. And essentially, Adobe has said we are committed to supporting both. The current version of Lightroom CC does not have all the features that Lightroom Classic does, so if you need specific features, and they have a nice comparison, these features do not exist, so don't even bother trying if this doesn't fit into your workflow. You can continue to use Classic, and the way that they've presented this is they will continue to develop both indefinitely. Now, we all know that indefinitely doesn't really mean forever, and this is where we get into the point of what this actually means for us. So, before we continue, David, please, anything that I've left out of that?
No, I think that and I want to say for the record before we start debating Adobe's stance towards these products, that I think Lightroom CC is a fantastic product. I've been using it. I think a cloud-based infrastructure makes a lot of sense for the majority of users. I think that the speed of the internet's not there yet for the majority of the users. I'm fortunate to live in an area with very fast internet connectivity, and it's still, the workflow wouldn't quite work for me.
Oh, okay.
I have.
Well, just to point out, you have gigabit up and down.
I have gigabit up.
And you're saying that workflow wouldn't work for you?
Well, it would work. It would work for me very well up until a certain point. And then the certain points are things that I think that Adobe will work on at some point with Lightroom, and it will not be an issue at any point. I think that Lightroom is a 1.0, and it is clearly a 1.0. I am completely in favor of companies abandoning an old code base, starting again, and going forward. I think the Final Cut change was a great example of that. The Final Cut that ran under OS 9, that was working in OS 10, basically at some point they're like, that's it, we're going to do a new one. And the new version didn't have 80% of what a professional needed. Now, Apple has, in the long run, kept to their promises of keeping that product alive. Unfortunately, they did that change right when they had killed off Aperture. And so on one hand, you have a company committing to a professional group and killing off their product. And on the other hand, you have a company committing to a group and rebooting the product. And what Apple didn't do when they made Final Cut Pro 10 is they didn't call the old one Classic. They just stopped supporting it. And they said pretty clearly, will run up until the point at which we don't need it anymore, and it will stop being supportive.
Right. Well, remember, actually, when they first started selling Final Cut 10, Final Cut 7 was pulled from the shelves. It was no longer available, and it was only due to pressure from the public that they not re-released, but started reselling a Final Cut 7. Yeah.
Right, and I think that they had misanticipated, the people who had it as an installed app are not the only people who ever need it, and there's plenty of service bureaus that don't have it installed when they're not using it or
Right.
hadn't started yet. And so the people becoming a professional that day needed a way to work with the professionals that existed.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And I think when we talk about the features that Lightroom CC, or I might call it new Lightroom, have, they are great, but some of the things that were left out in the 1.0 sort of point towards a market base that isn't necessarily a professional.
Sure.
So, for example, you have a histogram, but I can't adjust curves. So that's a feature that's been in every professional piece of software since, Photoshop. I don't know which version got curves, but probably very early on.
I'm sure, yeah.
And so I think a big issue here is that Adobe is not handling the optics, as they would say on the West Wing, of this transition very well, or they're handling it really well, and they made specific decisions, and people are rightfully taking from those decisions Adobe's plans for the future.
Right.
So you take a product and you call it Classic, and it is the product that literally millions of photographers use, and probably, how many professional photographers are there in the world? 12. But, whatever percentage of the user base for Lightroom is the professional user, those people are very committed to it, and they have a very long established workflow. And now they've just been told that the product that Adobe sold yesterday as being the cutting edge solution is now the Classic solution. And then there's a new workflow that is out and doesn't have a lot of the features that the pros need, that the pros have been investing in the platform for, right? So plugins and all kinds of workflow things, they're not there. So in one day, the professional sees not only is their product sort of diverged in the product line, but one version of it is clearly going to go away at some point because it's called Classic and not Lightroom Pro or Lightroom Desktop, right? And then you see another version that comes out and it's got all the features that the enthusiasts need. And if Lightroom were a pro app first and then an enthusiast app second, I think that's not the way the 1.0 would ship. Right. That said, Adobe also has a history of releasing things that are some other companies might do as a beta into the wild to see what people say they want to see in the program.
Right. They're not calling this one beta, but yeah, I mean, it is obviously missing some key features. And I don't disagree with anything you're saying there. I think that the big place where we diverge on this is what this really means for the pro. And I see the Classic, and the naming is a curious point, right? Naming is a really critical thing that companies can get very, very wrong. Going back to the Final Cut example, when Final Cut 10 came out, in my mind, that should not have been called Final Cut Pro 10. If they had simply dropped the word Pro, if they had simply called it Final Cut 10 and simultaneously left Final Cut 7 running, and then after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it was, before they finally got Final Cut 10 up to the point where it was truly a pro product, then added the word Pro back in, then that would have eased the transition for the market. And they could have very publicly said, as they did, this is the future. Right, we're not developing the old version anymore. This is the future. Time to get on board, but we get that it doesn't do everything that you need, so we'll give you a couple of years to make the transition as we add features and so on. I see that as what is happening here. I see Adobe's transition, and again, the naming, maybe it's unfortunate, maybe calling it Classic isn't the best terminology, but it does, as you say, it does tell the world that this is not going to be around forever. They're saying that this is our new version. CC is the new one. We know it doesn't have everything that you need. So we're going to simultaneously develop both, and I guess what the real tell point in that is going to be if in the next major release there's some awesome new feature that pros want in Classic that's not in Classic, or that shows up in CC and doesn't show up in Classic. Right,
and I think we're seeing that already. There's features that aren't there. I mean, the cloud-based workflow and the syncing among devices works better right now in CC, right? So it already does have. It already does have things that are better. It has a better interface, right? The interface in Lightroom, new Lightroom, is in many ways a significant improvement over the workflow in Lightroom Classic. So if Classic were to do something like ditch the individual library module and the develop module, which has been ditched in new Lightroom, I think that would be a big indication that the features of the new thing are helping to motivate development in the previous program. But I mean, I don't want to put too much in the word Classic, but I also want to focus on that a little bit because in the history of marketing, the naming of a product classic is in textbooks as the biggest blunder any company has ever made in the history of the world, right? So, Adobe is a bazillion-dollar company. I know that their product names don't generally deviate much from Photoshop and Lightroom, and the difference is that they get rid of a CS6 and now they're just CC, right? And it's CC 2017. So Adobe is not a terribly creative product naming company to begin with, right? And they chose what is the biggest marketing mistake in the history of the world as the name of the product that professionals depend on. Now, if Classic had come out and there had been feature parity with the new version and they called it Classic, I think that would have been less of an issue for the people I've spoken to, but there isn't.
But what would be the point then? What would be the point of having, if they were feature parity, then why even keep the old one around? You may as well just say, right, this is the new version, the new way.
Right, and so why not wait till you have a point where you can have feature parity, right? If you're going to replace a tool and it's going to address the needs of the photographer, the pro photographer, why not wait until it's going to do that until you release it?
Well, because you can always say for any product, 1.0 was really a 0.5. They should have waited until X point to release this product. But in reality, that could be years and years from now, and it probably will be years and years from now before that's ready. Why force everybody to wait, or why keep it a secret for a decade, better part of a decade, while you're doing development? And we'd imagine that CC's been in development for at least a number of years. And now we've got a version 1.0 that is a not complete product for pros, but again, it is the new architecture. It is the new way forward. And it's being released in a way that says, hey, for those of you who this works for, come on over. The water's lovely, jump in, you're gonna have some fun here. For those who it doesn't, say, hey, we're not abandoning you. You still got your old workflow. Eventually, you're going to need to switch over, but we're going to give you a lot of time, and we're not going to force you to switch. And they haven't even said this, but we're not going to force you to switch until that feature parity is there. You talk about things like the cloud-based architecture, but that is the entirety of what is CC, right? That is its whole thing, starting from scratch, throwing away all the old code, starting from scratch, which we assume they do. Obviously, we're not engineers, we don't know what they're actually doing, but we assume that they started over. And that allows them to do that architecture. It's the same thing like with Aperture to Photos. Aperture just couldn't do the cloud-based architecture that they needed without doing a complete rewrite. And so they did a complete rewrite, called it Photos, unfortunately killed Aperture entirely and never brought Photos up to what Aperture used to be.
Right, but there's the point, right? They did Photos, right? The engine in Photos was clearly what the next version of Aperture was going to be, right? And I have no insight into the development cycle. I wasn't still supporting the product at that time, but clearly the underlying architecture of Photos, Aperture would have done what Final Cut did, which was go to a new version, and the new version would have had professional features, at least enough to maintain the key workflow of the pros. I think that there will be a time at which everything is likely to be cloud-based, at least to some degree.
Sure.
And I really laud Adobe for not just saying, okay, we're going to stop supporting old Lightroom right now. It'll keep running, but we are not going to do any maintenance releases, which is something Apple has done before. I really applaud that. I think that this is a company that lives and dies by the implication that they're committed to the pro. And I think that the majority of the Aperture users I knew that used Aperture were using it because there was features in it that they needed for their workflow. And the majority of people that I knew who switched over to Lightroom when that released after Aperture was because they felt that Adobe had a long-term commitment to the solution. Now again, new Lightroom is a commitment to that solution. It's just this is an odd inflection point, right, for photographers. It's very similar to when digital first started, and some people could shoot with digital and some people still had to shoot film. There were workflows for both. It was clear that the film workflow was going to go away, and so film scanners were very popular, and it was how to take your archives and move them over. That is very much where we are in the terms of the infrastructure of cloud-based computing. But I don't think anybody ever would have thought to take film and called it photography classic, right? I mean, that just would have been a weird way to treat it. And so there's a couple of things. There's the Adobe says that they will support the Pro Photographer, which is great, and I hope that they continue to. Adobe also said that they will always have a standalone version of Lightroom because photographers don't want to pay a subscription to be able to run their studios for the rest of their lives. So they had a subscription version. They said that they would, a purchasing version. They said that they would have a standalone purchase version. That disappeared with the announcement. So they didn't say, hey guys, if you spent $200 on this app, we'll convert you over to a 2-year plan over here. Really sorry that we told you that we were going to buy something that you could use and we would keep supporting. We didn't. Sorry. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, Tom Hogarty, who I have a lot of respect for, had a blog post where he talked about the biggest thing about Lightroom is the speed, right? It's not fast enough. It's not fast enough. It's not fast enough. Well, that's been a concern of Lightroom users since the first version of Lightroom, right? It's always been a more cumbersome app than the CPU and the GPU at the time was given the access to. So for a long time, we're going to make it faster, and then now it's faster, which is great, but why didn't that happen, earlier on, right? Yeah. So you know that the product is slow, you know that the product is something that's got a workflow that you've been teaching photographers to use for a long time, you know that the technology isn't there in terms of streaming, right, and uploading over the cloud. It's an odd time to take one existing product, deprecate its name with an older name, and then make the new product the anointed version of that. I mean, Lightroom Cloud CC would have worked just dandy, I think, for a lot of people, right? Sure. And then, like you said, drop the cloud name or Lightroom Advanced or Lightroom anything else but just plain Lightroom. Drop the name when it's Pro. Naming
aside, forgetting about the naming of what they've called it, it seems like you're still not totally thrilled with the fact that they've done this in the first place and done it at this timing. How would you prefer to see it done differently? Again, forget about the name. Don't worry about the naming. How would you like to see things done differently at this point?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that there's an ideal way to transition to something, and then there's the real world. The ideal way to transition to something would be have a product that is feature parity, at least with the main functionality of a professional workflow, and pay more attention to the online, offline aspects of a professional photographer's workflow, and find a way to move people over more seamlessly. And I'm not saying that Adobe, how do I put this? I'm not saying that Adobe is not committed to the photographer. I feel that dropping something that the professionals asked for, the purchasability of the program, moving people over to subscription-based service when a lot of pros do not want to do that, and making a cloud-based infrastructure when a lot of pros do not want their images living on somebody else's server as their primary space, there isn't necessarily a perfect way to do it.
Yeah.
I think in the scale of great ways to do it, this was pretty poor in the terms of the optics for the professional photographer.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. For those watching live, if you have any questions or comments you want to throw up here and have us address, be sure to put them into the chat and put @PhotoJoseph in front of it. We've got a couple here. We're going to pull it up in a moment. So if you've got any, we'll jump over to the chat in just a minute here. I guess the way that I look at it, I'm not seeing quite as negative as you are on it. I see it, when I look at the way that Apple handled things, I would say that Adobe looked at what Apple did, both with Final Cut and with Aperture, and went, okay, we're not going to do it that way. Because that really screwed people up and really pissed off a lot of users. And they they definitely gained a lot of users when Aperture went away, because people needed to switch over to something. Yep. Now, I know that a lot of people are still using Aperture. I have users on PhotoApps.expert that are still using Aperture. We're getting reports that it's working just fine under High Sierra, so that's great news. But, of course, it hasn't been developed really since around 2010. I mean, there's just been barely anything added to it over the time. So Adobe benefited greatly from the killing of Aperture. Photos still is not what Aperture is, and Apple handled that very poorly, pissed off a lot of people. So I think that Adobe looked at it and went, well, we've got to make the transition, as you've pointed out yourself. The old code had to go away. They had to start fresh to really bring things up to speed, up to a modern architecture, and so that means starting from scratch. And sure, they could have developed it for another year, 2 years, or 3 years without releasing it, but you've got a product that, let's face it too, does need to make money. It does not like developing this as free. Adobe's got to make some money off of this product, and they get it to a point where they say, well, it's good enough for a lot of people, which undoubtedly is going to be a lot of their users, that CC is perfectly fine, then they can go ahead and make that happen.
I think so too. It just shows which customer base is the priority, right? If the priority were the professional customer base, they wouldn't be able to release a product until it was doing all the things that a pro need for their workflow.
Okay, but
if you release it for 90% of the customers, and 90% of the customers are not pros, right?
Right.
Then that is simply showing that the product is enthusiast first, photographer second, pro photographer second.
But I don't think it's fair to say that in the sense that Adobe doesn't care about the pro or Adobe cares more about the consumer. The fact is there are more consumers. That's not an Adobe decision. That's just the real world, right? There's a hell of a lot more enthusiasts than there are actual working pros. And Adobe obviously needs to stay in business. They need to make money. They need to make a product that, to some degree, you could probably argue that the income from the consumer, from the prosumer, the enthusiast, is what helps fund for the pros. Because if
sure, and I think that we're saying the same thing in that regard, right? That the enthusiasts are what drives the market. The enthusiasts are the most enthusiastic based on the name, and they have the greatest connection to new technologies.
Sure.
Most of the enthusiasts are shooting with cameras that have web connectivity. Some of them push directly from the cameras. They're shooting with phones. The iPhone and Google Pixel keep getting better all the time, right? So so yeah, the enthusiast clearly should be the primary focus of the marketing and development for photo-based applications, because, I think last time I checked, when I did something about pro photographers, there might have been like 150,000 people or something like that in the country that are actually, from a taxes standpoint,
sure,
right, a pro photographer. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense to do it. I'm going to use Lightroom CC. I think it's a great idea. I think there's a huge amount of workflow that is right now import a thing, to sync a thing, to export a thing, to go find the thing, to come back and do the thing. But the workflow where I'm doing that is a professional web publishing workflow, and it's not a professional photography workflow.
Sure.
The other issue that I think a lot of people have on the professional side is that a professional doesn't necessarily want their infrastructure tied to a single service made by a single provider, especially a single provider that promised them a standalone version and killed it, and then changed the name of their app to Classic, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that there's a lot of curmudgeonly professional photographers. I've worked with a lot of them. I think that they will, in the long run, be the dinosaurs in photography. I think the people who pick up new technology quickly will succeed, and I think this app will help them. I just think that there's the group of photographers are now said, like, you want to use this product, you're using the cloud, you're using our cloud, you're using something without as many features. I haven't checked this, but I heard right now NAS support isn't working, so if your stuff's on a network attached storage device, you can't get to it in CC. I think that there's some communication hurdles that Adobe really should have addressed beforehand. One of the reasons I started the Aperture group, I was at Photo District News, I was working there for a long time. Day one of Photo Plus, where Apple announced Aperture 1.0, I went up to Joe Shore after the demonstration, and I said, I didn't know him. These are the 10 things that people will tell you tomorrow are wrong with the product, right? And
good way to make friends, right?
Well, I said hello first. I didn't launch right into that. Hi, my name is David. Here's the 10 things that are wrong with your product. And I said, you guys should get ready for this. This is what the feedback is going to be, and then that's what the feedback was. And then when Aperture 1.5 came out, it was a market improvement. They listened to the concerns of the photographers and changed the online-offline storage capabilities. Yep. I went back and said, you guys did such a poor job in the 1.0 that you need somebody to come and champion the product to let people know that the mistakes they made when you did the 1.0 aren't going to carry through with the life of the product. And there was a lot of people who said to me, I don't want to use the program because I can't choose where to put my images. They live inside a catalog. Yeah. And there's going to be a lot of people right now who say, I don't want to use the program. I don't want to choose if they live inside the cloud. And then there's going to be a lot of people say, I don't want to use this program as a pro because the only cloud I can use right now is Adobe's cloud. I mean, I have terabytes and terabytes of images, and thanks to my connection, I can push them to the cloud. They live on Backblaze for $5 a month for unlimited storage. So, I have 8 terabytes of data, 10 terabytes of data or something on Backblaze. It's not a syncing service. It's a recovery service, but it's certainly possible to make a streaming service that doesn't cost very much. And then the other thing, there's a group of photographers, and I don't know how much this is paranoia, but you look at something like the artificial intelligence, which I love. I think that the program should be smarter than the average user. You look at the artificial intelligence, the keywording. I've talked to a couple of people who say that's just a way that Adobe is going to try and find stuff for their stock business. That this is going to start sending out, hey there, I see that you've got a terabyte of images. Would you like to be, reviewed for Adobe stock? And now all the images are already keyword and cataloged. And I don't think that's a bad thing either.
I was going to say, is that a bad thing?
No, I mean, it's not a bad thing for you and I. It's a bad thing for the photographer who's currently making money off of, premium stock. I don't think the stock industry needs to stay in business. I mean, that's not what I'm saying.
Right.
I'm just saying that there's a bunch of groups who, with this transition, are getting a message of either being a second nature, or being the second class user now, as opposed to the main reason the program exists, to something that exists to help Adobe monetize a subscription service. Now, Adobe has all the rights in the world to do that, right? They make the toys. That's what they want to do. We choose whether we want to use it or not. That's totally Adobe's job.
Yeah. Well, I can't disagree with that. All right, let's pull up some comments. There's some good stuff coming in here and a couple of questions that I'm sure users are hoping to get answered here. Trevor Pinnicky was asking about the name change shift, and I think we've covered that pretty well. Obviously we can't. He's saying why not continue the naming system we have and call more mobile version LRMC, mobile computing, or something like that. And obviously we can't speak for Adobe as to why they made the decisions that they did. I think the CC, the Creative Cloud designation, it's already got the cloud in the name, so that's, people may not necessarily think of CC that way, but that is what it is, Creative Cloud. And it does point towards this cloud service that we're all going towards. And we'll get to a day where internet connections everywhere, mobile, desktop, whatever, will be fast enough where it just won't matter. Your pictures will be anywhere. You'll be able to edit this raw photo, and you may not even have to download the raw photo. You'll be able to access some cloud, network computer, big old pile of processors in the cloud that you can do some amazing edits to that you don't have to actually have on your local device. The ability to do really high-level work on a tiny little screen doesn't mean that this tiny little screen has to get that much more powerful. It just means that the internet connection to the powerful machine somewhere else has to get fast enough, and that's happening. Right. There's no doubt about that happening. So, name is what it is. Whether we like it or not, we can debate, but it doesn't really matter because whatever the product's called, it does what the product does. Trevor's also saying, I'd like to use Lightroom more. At one point I did, but over time I found the product didn't go deep enough for me. One thing Adobe could do is add layers. What's the resistance to doing that? That's a really good question, and I would say, and let's hear what you think, I think the only reason not to add layers is that would cannibalize Photoshop.
I think that's 100% of the reason. You look at something like Capture One Pro that has incredibly discrete layer support. I could make, I don't know if it's finite at this point, but I can make more layer adjustments in Capture One Pro than I need and adjust just minute or gross areas of the image. And that's been in there for quite some time. I agree with you. I think that layers is something that specifically keeps people from going away from Photoshop. And then, here's that thought again, right? You and I both think that the main reason that there isn't layer support in Lightroom is because Adobe doesn't want to cannibalize sales of another product. So they can make here's a decision that we both think that they could make that could add something to the package that would help the professional, but the decision is to keep another program necessary.
Okay, so following that train of thought, though, so you've got Photoshop that, as far as I know, it's already called CC, but it's obviously not a cloud-based service.
Right.
Were there any major announcements for Photoshop itself?
There were not. There were some new features added, but it wasn't
nothing big. Okay. So we've got Lightroom CC that is clearly the future. Lightroom Classic and Photoshop, which we talk about cannibalizing sales, but again, it is a subscription service. That is the majority of how they're selling it, and for $10 a month, you do get both. You get Lightroom and Photoshop. So maybe the cannibalization isn't such a concern, but if they were to start adding layers into Lightroom CC, maybe they would start to get more of that into there, something we don't have in Lightroom Classic. Maybe we will get that in CC farther down the road.
Yeah, I hope so. I think that's the case. I mean, I also think that Lightroom Lightroom Classic suffered from a long history of features being added on top of a code base that wasn't meant to store it, and you can't do that. So the real reason of why there aren't better layers might simply be the app would have ground to a halt.
Right.
And now starting again, it won't.
Yeah. Fair enough. Daddy MCC says, do you see more Lightroom users moving to something like Affinity now? You know, Affinity Photo, of course, is a really robust app. I've been enjoying it a lot. I've been doing a lot of training on it over on Photos.expert. But it's a Photoshop type app. It's not your asset management tool. And apparently I had missed this, but one of my readers sent me an email saying that apparently Affinity kind of let slip that they aren't actually working on a DAM, where they had said they were in the past, but now they've said that they're not. Now MacFun has said that they are working on one, and they just released a little promo video that's looking pretty slick, but you know, it's just a promo video, it's not a product, so it's still a long ways out before we see anything there. Does this give people an opportunity to move elsewhere? Of course it does. If people are going to have to make a change, then it's a good time to look around and go, okay, well, what else is out there? Yeah. And one of the things I was going to mention before but didn't get to, we talk about this transition to this cloud, Lightroom Cloud, Lightroom CC. Where's, I'll get the right preset up. Lightroom CC. Let's not forget that Apple Photos just had a major update, and it's a lot better now. They've added a ton more editing features in there. There's some serious growth happening in Photos. It's still not a pro app. It is still not Aperture, but it is probably more advanced even than Lightroom Cloud, Lightroom CC. And I haven't done a side-by-side yet, and I need to do that. That's something I'm going to have to do. For people coming into this market going, okay, I got to start from scratch, basically, where should I go? That's going to be a really interesting comparison, because if you are an Apple user, there's huge benefits to being part of that Apple ecosystem. So can what Adobe's Cloud doing, Adobe CC doing, beat that out? That's going to be interesting to see. So. Yeah,
and you have a tool that's built into people's operating systems, and they have it as part of a subscription they would already have to something like iCloud. Right. On the Google side, you've got Google Photos, which is incredibly powerful, and they own the technology of a whole bunch of plugins that they bought, and they do a lot of things programmatically that are brilliant. I think they're great tools. If I were the product marketing manager at Phase 1 at this point, I would probably have had glasses of champagne the day that Adobe made this, right? Because even if the perception is incorrect that Classic, is going to deprecate towards end of life, the time for people to start looking at other things has arrived for those product managers, and it would be a great time to tell people the story. I think it's hard to make a transition from one thing to another.
It is.
It's hard to take your old workflow and make it a new workflow, and it's harder when all of your images live on one particular person's subscription service. Right. Right. If you don't have your pictures here, then now you've put, it doesn't matter how fast the internet's going to get in the next bunch of years. Let's say, it took more than 2 straight weeks to get about 6 terabytes from one drive up, even with a gigabit Ethernet connection or gigabit internet connection. So now I've got 30 terabytes of images because the sensors get bigger. I bought a D850, and now I've got a big sensor or whatever. Right. And I got 20 terabytes on Adobe's service. How long is it going to take me to move it off of Adobe service if I want to? Right. If Apple came out and did Photos Pro and I wanted to move to that infrastructure, how hard would it be? Right now, all I have to do is point a new program at my referenced folders. Right. And I'm using a new program. That's it. That's all I have to do. Now I'll lose some of my keywording and stuff unless I import, there's a good tool to import a catalog, but I could start with another program today. Can I do that? With 30 gigs or 30 terabytes of data on somebody's machine? I don't know.
Well, I haven't dug into it enough yet, but can't you still keep force Cloud to keep a local copy?
Sure. But forcing an application to not do one of the primary features of it is, and you can also select on an individual level what you want to live in the cloud. Right. Right. But you take a photographer base that has difficulty really getting a handle on backup and storage just to begin with, and now you're selectively. The beauty of the new Lightroom is that everything can live up there. Right.
You don't have to worry about backup and storage. You got to pay for it. You got to pay a monthly, and you get to that 30 terabytes. That's going to get pretty expensive, but you don't have to worry about it. And that is a huge, even as a pro, Especially as a pro, that's a huge thing to not have to worry about. I'm dealing with data storage issues right now. Okay, I've got to upgrade something. I've got to make some changes. I need more storage space. What am I going to do? What am I going to throw away? If I could just pay another $5 a month and not have to worry about it, well, that'd be pretty cool. But that's not the case.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to. Well, you're not only going to pay another $5 a month. If the storage is Lightroom, you're going to max out that 1 terabyte plan at some point, and then you're going to buy a multiple terabyte plan. So you're not actually at $5 at that point.
No, I just meant to add another. I need a little bit more storage. I'll add a little bit more to what I'm already paying, and I don't have to go out and spend $1,000 on new raids and everything else.
And again, I'm not, like I don't want to sound like I am not appreciating the valuable tools that are inside Lightroom. I think. When I used to teach Aperture, maybe 50% of the 2-day workshop that I taught was teaching people how to manage their archives and back them up.
Yeah.
If that is replaced by launch the application, you're done, that probably does more for a professional market than anything they could have added to a desktop version, right? Because the day that somebody goes, I manage my files. I just recovered some images off an SD card because I did a shoot remotely, and when I came home, hadn't managed it with the workflow I normally do. The files were overwritten, on the desktop as a weird OS naming thing going to High Sierra. They hadn't backed up to Backblaze yet. Oh well, now I'm recovering a card, right? That wouldn't happen. I would have shot in the field, and stuff would have trickled slowly up. So at least whatever trickled up would have been there. And then when I came home and got on my connection, before I had a chance to have the drive renaming problem, it would have lived up on the cloud, and that's great. I mean, hooray!
Yeah.
Right, and that's going to be the strongest feature, I think, is the peace of mind.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It just, like I said, I'm dealing with this storage issue right now. I spent most of last week sorting it out. That's a lot of time spent screwing around with data storage issues that I don't have this kind of time. I don't want to be doing this. This is something that just should be automatic, could be automatic, and that's what we're going towards.
Yep.
We're getting there, but it's going to be a little while. All right, so some other comments coming in. Cameraman655 says, I'm very annoyed with Adobe for leaving out tools like the clone and healing with the current version of their mobile app as well as the previous. So now we're talking about the mobile version. Yeah, it is surprising to see some of the features that aren't there yet. It's clearly the technology exists. It's fast enough. The devices are fast enough. I don't know, any insight there into why some of these more basic features still aren't there?
I think it's a resource allocation. I mean, how many people did we know were on the programming team for Aperture, right? And how many people are probably on Lightroom? I think that there's a core group of coders that are working on their apps. Got a majority, let's say, hi, I'm the CEO of Adobe, and you guys are the mobile developers, and next month we're switching everybody over to a new Lightroom, and your devices have to seamlessly, all the mobile versions for iPad, iPhone, Android, all have to work for that portion of it. If we lose a file in the cloud on day one, we're done, right? That's going to take precedence in coding for me over the healing brush tool. Also, other than the people using a iPad Pro or another really large screen with good fidelity, it's really hard to see what your cloning and your healing is. Now,
that's true.
I think an automatic healing would be a fantastic thing. I just think that the people, don't understand how few people actually are behind the teams programming most of the software we use.
That's fair. That's fair. And as I understand it, all of the capabilities, the technology is in the app. The cloning capability, the tools, the back-end code is all there because you need to be able to sync a photo over that has cloning applied to it, and it shows up, and it will show up. Those clones show up. It's just that there's no UI yet to access it, manipulate it, add them, or remove them.
Right. It can read. It's a layer of data that it can read, and it currently can't write to it.
Currently can't write to it. Fair enough. Frank Lovett has a comment here saying that Apple Photos for a DAM plus Affinity Photo works really well for me as a committed Apple infrastructure user. And this is a great point. We've got the necessity to have Lightroom as a whole gets less and less for more and more users as you have more advanced tools that plug into Apple Photos as an extension.
And I'm looking up right now because I want to say the name correctly, but Alien Skin's Exposure X3 now does file management to it too, and so it went from being a plugin to Photoshop and Lightroom, and now there's a full damn UI to it. Not quite as versed in terms of things like Lightroom and Photoshop and Lightroom and Aperture were in terms of some of the things you can do. As far as I've only played with it for about a week now, but a lot of companies are going, hey, there's people that are not going to want to they're not going to want to do this cloud thing, or they're going to want to do desktop first. I think that I don't know what the future, use cases, how many people will end up using a third-party program like this, as opposed to Adobe's thing. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the camera space, right, so you look at the pro camera market, and then you look at the position of Adobe, and the position of Nikon and Canon, and then Sony comes in, and Sony is taking some of the market space away. They only have to pull a certain amount of people away in order to have a really profitable division.
Right.
And for a lot of these little companies now, how many thousand more people does Capture One Pro need to double its profit?
Sure.
Right. So some of these companies, I think, will develop some really great solutions because a lot of the pros will go talk to them, and these guys will try very quickly to add the features that are being requested into it. Whereas I feel like a lot of people made a lot of requests for features for things like Lightroom, and they're still waiting for some of those, and now the program is done.
Yep. Yeah, fair enough, and you're absolutely right. There are companies like Affinity is a great example of that. The photo app from Affinity has been developed beautifully. It's a really, really robust app, both on macOS and on iOS. And then I don't know if you're familiar with an app called Polar, which is it's remarkable as far as just a basic image editor, but it has a lot of really cool tools like face manipulation, adjusting the eye size, teeth whitening, this kind of thing automatically. That works really, really well, and it is feature parity, and the UI, the features, everything is identical across iOS, macOS, Windows, Android, and even Chrome OS. And it works as a fully functional extension on Photos. So you do have these tools being built in, and they're a tiny little company where if you send them an email and say, hey, I'd love to see this feature in there, right, odds are it's going to show up in the next release. Right,
and I think that's where Adobe is headed too. I think that the idea for Adobe is feature parity across all the versions of their tools. I definitely know that they could not have gotten there with Lightroom Classic, and so you need to start over to get that feature parity. So, 2 years from now when we have another one of these calls, this point may be moot, but I do think that there's going to be a lot of people leaving at this point because of communication of the changes,
right,
and the marketing around those changes. And that's a shame, because if somebody's going to end up with a better product that does more things, and their current workflow isn't really endangered, there's a lot of people who just said, yeah, that's it, I'm done, I'm out of here, right? And I see this in online gaming forums a lot. Like, people will request a feature, and then, the company will release an app that is a freemium, app that does something else. And they're like, okay, the company's clearly, they give up. The company's clearly
right,
just but the company's probably just trying to make enough money on a freemium app to do all the things, right? So, it can go either way at this point. My main issues with it were simply optics and what it says to the professional photographer in terms of the workflow being used by everyone who considers themselves to be a pro today is now a classic workflow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Nope. True stuff. All right, a couple more comments here, and then we're going to wrap this thing up. Burns Tech is talking about being a high-end user here. He says, I'm not a fan of cloud services for storing my stuff. I prefer to keep multiple/redundant backups with my own infrastructure. Being quite tech-savvy, this is easy for me. I also understand the convenience and strength of cloud services. For some, it makes perfect sense, but for me, no. And that's awesome that Burns is there on that, but the vast majority of users are not. And even if they are, it's a case of, do I really want to deal with it? Am I technically capable of doing that? Yes. Is that really how I want to spend my time? No. I'd rather be making pictures, editing pictures, doing cool stuff with images, not being an IT department. And that's fair. People shouldn't have to do that. We all drive cars. Most of us don't work on them. We don't need to know how it works. We take it to someone who fixes it, and that's the end of the discussion. There's just no point anymore. We may as well work on the things that we want to work on.
And there's some infrastructures that will never be able to move to the cloud. There's plenty of people who do photography work in IP-sensitive things, who are doing photography work in medical things, where either legally or just from a workflow, you're not storing your images, even if encrypted, on somebody else's storage. I mean, with Equifax losing so many people's data, I mean, can you imagine shooting for the military and you're storing your images locally, and now you're going to store things on the cloud? It's just not going to happen, right? I don't think that any software company should build an app based on the needs of the dozen people shooting for the military. But I think that Lightroom CC's got a way to go, and shows tremendous promise. I think that you're right. I think that the majority of the users don't care, don't want to care, shouldn't care.
Yep. No, very, very true. John says, so long as they cater for all online storage options with their plans. Dropbox, for example, does not. Hit 1 terabyte as a single user, and you can't buy any more space, period, which is lunacy. I see. On Dropbox, I guess you've got a limit. I thought you could buy more space.
I think he's saying for Lightroom right now, right?
Well, Lightroom you can. You can absolutely add. There's a price per terabyte that you can add. I don't know that there's.
Yeah, I think if you switch to Lightroom. If you switch to Dropbox Business, which is more expensive than the standard one, I think I have a 20 terabyte share as part of that. It's something like it's $10 a seat or something, minimum of 3 seats. I'd have to go look it up, but there are bigger plans.
And there's always the ability to roll your own. I mean, you can just, if you really want to get that tech savvy about it, Amazon, you can get as much space as you want there. Start filling up servers.
Yep, that's true.
All right, last couple ones. This is an interesting point. Craig Staples says, if all you need is a simple digital asset management tool, why not just use Adobe Bridge? As far as I know, it's a free app from Adobe, maybe the only free app. I don't know about being free or not, but Adobe Bridge to me is a very old school way of handling your photos. I haven't used it, and I don't even know how long. I never used it full time as a professional. Do you have any experience with it, David?
Yeah, it is a good tool for people who don't want a dedicated asset management program, who just want to store their files where they want them and take a look at them. Using Bridge or Photo Mechanic at this point, I feel sort of like if we now have new Lightroom and we had classic Lightroom, I feel like using Bridge would be sort of like drinking the Coca-Cola version, to use this analogy, back when cocaine was still in it. Like, it's that old. There's certainly nothing wrong with whatever tool you want to use to access your files. I think the idea of a asset management is good search keywording rating abilities. Bridge requires you to use something else to do your image editing. I don't think there's anyone who says, I just want to manage my assets, right? Right. You want to manage them and then edit them and then deliver them to people. So Bridge would be great if all you have to do is look in a folder of images and make sure that the folder of images are there. Not so great in a multi-user environment where people have to see what your keywords are and that sort of thing. Right,
absolutely. We're going to take this last one here. John Morby is saying, the point is we want to keep the option to use our own storage and not have our data exported into the cloud. Sometimes we want our property to remain our own private property. Well, hopefully the property is not an issue, but of course we've seen the kind of terms of service that companies like Facebook put up there. But that aside, yeah, having the option to have your own storage, that's something that I think is going to they're going to have to figure out at some point, because it's fine to say you can only store it in the cloud, or it has to go into the cloud when it's small and we're talking about just a couple of users, a couple of pictures. But yeah, when you start getting into the dozens of terabytes, it's just not realistic for a lot of people. And of course, there's going to be times where no matter how fast the internet is, you're somewhere where you just don't have that kind of access, and you need to be able to have pictures with you.
Yeah, and they've addressed that for right now, right? You can store it locally, and then it'll move up to the cloud when you have better connectivity. I think that's a two-pronged problem, and I think that's the head of the problem. I think he nailed it. Lightroom right now doesn't have the tools to be able to manage things as adroitly as Classic does. That will be fixed with software, right? Those updates will eventually, at some point, if people say, well, like, we need also, this is non-synced, this is on my machine, that's fine. If that doesn't come about, that's a bigger problem, right? And that's what a lot of people like that question feel is, that's never going to happen. I'm never going to be able to have 5 terabytes over here and 2 terabytes there, because the whole point of Lightroom, the new one, is to have all of your images available wherever you go. Yeah. And so if you could pick a bunch of your images that don't go somewhere and don't sync, then you might as well just bolt that feature on top of the existing Lightroom. Yeah. So I think that's the crux of the issue, is that the people who need and want their images under their own care feel left out and possibly being developed away from, while the people who are really happy to have their images thought of by somebody else and where they live by someone else are embracing it. Yeah. And that's the point. And we'll see 1, 2, 5 years down the road what things get added here. But I think Lightroom, new Lightroom, will be great. And I think a lot of photographers will either come to appreciate the features that they add to Lightroom to bring it to parity with Classic, or they will move off to another asset management tool. Luckily, there are other tools. You know, when Apple died, when Apple killed Aperture, pretty much it was, you know, Lightroom, Capture One Pro at that point was pretty kludgy. It was a difficult move, and so you know, a lot of people are like, oh, I only have one thing I can do. Well, luckily there's a lot of companies rushing in now, and so that's going to change too.
Yeah. Yep. We shall see. And it's going to be very interesting to see, even, like I said earlier, about how Photos continues to develop and whether it's ahead of Lightroom CC at some point, if it isn't already. And that's something I will definitely be looking at over on PhotoOps.expert. David, thank you very much. This has been fun. This has been a good discussion. Hopefully some people got their questions answered and are not more confused than when we started. No, I really don't know what to do.
That is the goal, I guess, right?
Well, to some degree that is absolutely. Anything you'd like to plug before we jump out of here?
No, people can just follow us over at Digital Photography. Digital Photo Pro is one of my magazines. Digital Photo is the other magazine, dpmag.com, digitalphotopro.com. You can follow us on social media at those various things. You know, we try and take on those magazines a really serious approach to photography, and we're always trying to be in the corner of the photographer, especially the pro, and that's why these sort of issues are really important to us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And if you haven't checked out the site or magazine, please do, everybody. Of course, for me, you know, you can follow me on PhotoJoseph everywhere, and if you're watching this YouTube video for the first time, do be sure to subscribe. YouTube.com/PhotoJoseph. Just scroll down somewhere on here. There's a thing to subscribe to. Maybe there, and you'll figure it out. But subscribe, hit that little bell so you get notified when we go live. We do go live every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9:30 a.m., usually talking about specific technologies around photography. And in this case, of course, we had our special guest on so we could discuss the merits of this transition. Also, if you are a GH5 user, just real quick plug here for my training, gh5training.com. If you do have a GH5 and you don't have this training, you should. The cost of only 5% of what you spent on the camera itself, 5.5 hours of very robust, very in-depth training on that camera. It's something you definitely want to check out. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in today who's watching us live. And for those who aren't watching live, if you have follow-up questions, go ahead and stick them in the comments down below. I'll try and bend David's arm to get him to keep an eye on those comments, see if there's any questions that he can address. Otherwise, thanks a bunch for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.